Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to my review of the Artemis Fowl series by Oin Colfer. So, full disclosure, I read the first three when they came out as a wee Eichmann, and then proceeded to forget the series existed. With the recent release of the Artemis Fowl movie, which I haven't seen and refuse to see since every review calls it a foul recreation, I decided to revisit my childhood and reread the entire 8-book series from start to finish. Rather than a full in-depth review, this will be a quicker ranking video where I will rank all books from best to worst, since I don't have much to say in the grand scheme of things, but really want to rant about my two least favorite books. Fair warning, if you haven't read them, I'm not going to hold back on spoilers, so if you don't want anything spoiled, stop here. So let's get into it. For those unaware, the Artemis Fowl series revolves around a child genius named Artemis Fowl, who discovers that deep within the Earth's core is a fairy civilization. And while it starts with him blackmailing them for gold, eventually he's helping them face off against devious foes. So we have elves, centaurs, dwarves, pixies, goblins, humans, rebellions, plots, kidnappings, everything your little heart could desire. But let me be clear, these are very much young adult novels. They're fun and interesting, but don't go in expecting amazing character development or intricately linked plot lines. For the most part, the books are straightforward and very much a gateway book for younger audiences into more mature themes. But now for the ranking. My favorite book in the series is of course the original, Artemis Fowl, first of its name. Before going in too deep, I will acknowledge my bias. This book I picked up off the shelf when I was 11, and I adored it. I remember reading the first chapter in store and coming across an alcoholic fairy blew my mind. I'd never encountered such destructive characters before in my reading, so this was a real first step towards adult books, and it stuck with me. That being said, there's something special about the first book in the series, where the premise is so intriguing and well done that it becomes successful enough to spawn an entire series. This book stands on its own, and I just overall consider it a fun experience. If I could share a single gripe, and if I'm wrong on this, please feel free to correct me, but when the fairies establish the time field, they use the towers that are part of the wall that surrounds the Fowl estate. Now, in the book, Artemis Fowl outsmarts the time field and subsequent biobomb by drinking a tranquilizer. The idea being that when one loses consciousness, they fall out of the time field. This gets around the fact that while in a time field, one cannot sleep. And here's my problem. There's a moment in the book where a fairy SWAT team is approaching the manor itself and Butler the bodyguard proceeds to fight them. He knocks out and incapacitates all members of the team save one, but when these fairies get knocked unconscious, wouldn't they then get immediately dropped out of the time field? I guess you could argue that they were incapacitated and not unconscious, but one elf was literally slammed in the face with full force by the reinforced front door, and he was flung all the way into the bushes and is not seen to be moving again. Is he not unconscious? It's a problem, and honestly probably should take this book for my top spot, but again childhood bias, so we're going to leave it where it is. Next up we have Book 5, The Lost Colony. This book is amazing and has crazy stakes. It turns out that there's an entire hidden race of demons, manageable time travel, a second child genius just as devious as Artemis Fowl, a full-on battle, and an island-exploding bomb. This book is wild and tons of fun. The only thing I have a small issue with is that Artemis Fowl goes through a small time journey with a demon, and when he returns home discovers that his index finger and middle finger have changed places, and as far as I can remember, it never gets addressed and is never brought up again. It happens, then proceeds to immediately be forgotten about. In the third slot is Book 2, The Arctic Incident. This book has large stakes for the fairy city of Haven, and starts Artemis' journey from self-interested supervillain to world-saving selfless sacrificer. More importantly, this solidifies our main cast of characters with Mulch and Holly joining Artemis and Butler on their adventures. This is also our introduction to Opal Cowboy, the big bad of the entire series, and while I do think she is overused, she's great here. We also learn more about Artemis' family, and he's finally able to find his father who went missing in Russia, and provides greater context for the first Fowl book. Fourth place belongs to Book 3, The Eternity Code. Butler gets put on ice, and our big bad that needs to be taken down this time is a human. This is fun because it's very much an Ocean's 11 style caper, but where it really shines is that Butler's sister Juliet gets brought to the front line. She's a wild card and tons of fun as she creates chaos left, right, and center. It's just really unfortunate that this is the last we'll see of her until Book 7. This book does have consequences though, since it involves Artemis & Co. finally getting mind-wiped, which is pretty significant, but with the power of reading the next book, it becomes mostly irrelevant. Fifth place is Book 7, The Atlantis Complex. This book is actually great for what it attempts, which is Artemis contracting a disease known as Atlantis Complex, and we get to see his descent into madness, paranoia, OCD, and split personalities. Unfortunately, the fact that these books are young adult fiction means that on the whole the substance is lacking. It would be great if we could spend a long time with Artemis as he attempts to fight it off, and it starts strong with some great characterization, but unfortunately the young adult part comes out on top. A heretofore unknown villain has conducted a dastardly plot and has killed a bunch of important fairies, and of course the gang needs to stop them. Oh, cue a lot of chases, people getting captured, a weird love plot, both for the villain and Artemis, and while it's fine, it really left me feeling like I wanted to see more. I wanted to see the interactions between Holly, Butler, and Artemis as they realize that he's in trouble and how to help him. Don't get me wrong, those moments are there, but they quickly fall by the wayside as we instead need to focus on deadly spacecrafts, blobs of doom, and prison escapes. I'll fully admit that maybe reading all of these books one after another may have been a mistake, as near the end I was definitely wanting more fleshed out situations and interactions that are found in adult fiction. Up next at number 6 is Book 4, The Opal Deception. This book is fine, but once again, young adult fiction means a couple things. Shorter books, lots of action, which means that our major problem, which is that Artemis and Butler got mind-wiped at the end of Book 3, need to somehow get their memories back. For Butler, this happens almost immediately after an explosion, but Artemis takes a bit longer. So Opal has once again planned an elaborate escape and wants to destroy the world of fairies by revealing them to humanity and ruling the world. She also wants to split her time between doing that and killing Holly and Artemis. Obviously, plans are hatched by Artemis and everything is A-okay. Honestly, a bit of an underwhelming book, and I'm not a fan of Opal, but here she's okay. The problem is that she's also present for the remaining 2 books on my list, and she sucks. Okay, so quick mention, at number 7 is Book 8, The Last Guardian, and in last place is Book 6, The Time Paradox. I'm going to do both of these together for 2 reasons. The first is that a lot of stuff happens in Book 6, which then influences Book 8, but to talk about Book 8 first, then go back to Book 6 on my list would just make it very confusing. So I'm going to start by talking about Book 6, then go to 8, but remember that 6 is the worst, with 8 significantly higher but still not great. Confused? Good, because it's going to get a lot worse. Also, as mentioned at the start, these are the 2 books I really wanted to talk about, so here's the majority of the video. So the Time Paradox. Allow me to set the stage. Following his escapades in the Lost Colony, Artemis Fowl returns home with a wee bit of fairy magic under his control, which he then proceeds to use on his parents in order to explain away his years-long absence. Unfortunately, it turns out that in so doing, he has infected his mother with an old fairy disease known as speltropy, with the only known cure being found in the brain fluid of an extinct species of lemur, which, surprise surprise, Artemis Fowl caught and sold as a young boy. So the only way to save his mother is to go back in time, have future Artemis steal the lemur from past Artemis before it gets sold and killed, and then bring it back to the present so that the fairies can synthesize the cure. Except spoilers, it's all a lie. It turns out that past Opal Cowboy is actually hidden in the house and has possessed Artemis Fowl's mom and given her the symptoms of speltropy to then make Artemis go back in the past and get the lemur. But Grim, how can past Opal Cowboy already be in the present when Artemis has yet to go back into the past? And here's where I hate time travel stories. It never ends well, they always leave glaring plot holes, and are rarely done well. And while you could argue that the name of the book Time Paradox lampshades the whole thing, it's just bad. This is a situation where essentially the past and the future are constantly interacting in a closed loop and influencing each other at the same time, and is confusing garbage. For instance, it turns out that while Artemis thinks that he sold the lemur to an animal extinction group and it was subsequently killed, in reality it was all organized by past Opal Cowboy, and she had set up a lab in the basement of the Extinctionist Complex where she did genetic experimentation, which resulted in her giving herself superpowered fairy powers. Which then begs the question, if past Opal Cowboy has super awesome mind powers and can shoot lasers, why didn't she use them back in Book 2 during the Goblin Rebellion rather than being her useless self? And there's no answer, because the author didn't think that far. And here I want to quickly diverge because I purposefully said author rather than Colfer. I do not believe that Colfer wrote this book. It sounds insane, I know, but it just feels like a completely different book. For example, suddenly and for no reason in this book there's mention that Holly Short, our fairy companion, needs to turn her head and crack her neck in order to check to see how much magic she has left and prepare her magic for spells. Except, she has never once done this in the previous 5 books, and she will never do it again after this. It's as if whoever was writing suddenly wanted to insert their own neat character quirk in the hopes that it would be established fact. And this is a big deal. We've had things added in later books to no ill effect. For example, initially dwarfs eat earth to dig tunnels, and their beard hairs work as amazing lockpicks. Then as the books progress, it turns out that their spit is also luminescent, and even has tranquilizing properties. That's fine, it doesn't break any established lore, but rather adds to what already exists. But having Holly Short needing to literally turn her neck and crack it every time she wants to use magic? How? Why? That's so inefficient. It makes literally no sense to make magic which can be used instantaneously now need you to not only take a couple of seconds, but also break eye contact with whatever's in front of you in order to use it. It's bad writing. There's also the fact that there's brief mention that the most powerful warlock in the fairy world, the demon named Number 1, has undone the fairy rule which states that fairies cannot enter any dwelling without permission. This is huge and has a lot of repercussions, but none of them are addressed. Heck, the entire reason the plot of the first book happened was because the fairies could not just intrude into Artemis's house to get Holly back. But Grimm, that just goes to show that they've learned and won't let it happen again. Except the entire reason it was put in place to begin with was to make sure that fairies had as little contact with humans as possible, since they wanted to keep their race a secret. Our good friend Mulch the Dwarf was one of the few fairies who gave up his magic entirely so that he could steal from humans. But now, any fairy can go into any building, putting the entire race at risk of discovery with zero repercussions. Again, this is a literal throwaway line and doesn't get brought up again. Whoever wrote this book tried to burn the entire Artemis Fowl world to the ground, and they did a great job. So anyway, Artemis Fowl gets the lemur back to the present, discovers that past Opal Cowboy followed him through the time stream, came out a couple days earlier, and possessed his mother. Which brings up an interesting question. Does the fairy rule keeping fairies out of buildings exist in the world, or is it restricted to each fairy? Because the implication is that it's the world, since it's expressly mentioned when past Cowboy enters past Artemis Fowl's manor that she can feel her magic being sucked away and feels sick. But then she drops into future Artemis's house with no repercussions. But because it's a kid's book, they want you to shut up and don't question anything. No complex thoughts here. So it ends with past Opal escaping into the future and past Artemis gets his mind erased. He wakes up in his bed in the past having only had a dream that makes him think of fairies. So once again the author needs to make this the defining moment that makes Artemis Fowl start searching for fairies, and it's so ham-fisted and bland. Is that it? Can we move on to the last book now? No, because there's one more thing I want to talk about here, and that's romance. So in the 5th book, Artemis Fowl comes across a girl who's a couple years younger than him, but just as smart with her own plots and dreams. It even brings up a possible plot of romance. Unfortunately, she's never seen again after this book, and that's fine. We don't need romance in every series. But then book 6 comes along, and boy howdy do we get romance. Suddenly Artemis and Holly start acting all bashful and crazy with one another. In one scene, Holly even kisses Artemis, and it's incredibly awkward. And I feel like this moment forced Colfer in subsequent books to deal with this in some way, and it's not dealt with well. In book 7, when Artemis gets Atlantis Complex and gets a split personality, said personality goes on about how much he and Artemis love Holly oh so deeply, and it's awkward to say the least. At least with the final book, it never gets overtly stated, and I think that's for the best. For example, fairies live for hundreds of years. How would the implications of that affect their relationship long term? We know from book 7 that a fairy and human can get married and it can affect the human's lifespan, but said human was also under the effects of black magic, so maybe that was responsible? We don't know. More importantly, how would a human and fairy relationship even work? Holly is like 3 feet tall, while it's assumed Artemis will reach about 6 feet in adulthood. But again, kids' book, so we don't go there. Frankly, I'm happy with Holly and Artemis having an extremely close friendship. I think they respect each other and care for each other, and not in a romantic way, but unfortunately Time Paradox author just had to throw that in. But I'm all raged out of that, and let's go to the final book, The Last Guardian, and why it's so far down the list, even though for the most part it wraps up the series nicely. I'll say a small gripe first, so allow me to set the scene. 2 gnomes call up the fairy police and show that they've captured past Opal Cowboy, who had come to the future in book 6. They say that if future Opal Cowboy is not released, they will murder past Opal. Now during this conversation there's a typo which says that these gnomes are instead goblins. Come on editor, catch this stuff. I assume at one point these 2 gnome kidnappers were goblins and this one line didn't get changed, but that's no excuse. That's the small gripe, but anyway, here we're once again talking about time travel and my large gripe. So from the time travel that we experienced in the Time Paradox, we know that past Opal cannot be killed because we know the past and the future are intricately linked in a closed loop, and one affects the other, so if past Opal is killed, then she would not have existed in the future to do all the events of books 2 through 8. So the fairy police decide to throw future Opal, who is in prison, into a nuclear reactor because the theory is that if past Opal dies, then anything her future self has worked on during the years between these 2 events, as well as the future Opal Cowboy herself, will explode violently. But it's all a trick done by future Opal, and she organized the whole thing. So the kidnappers kill past Opal, Everything explodes like is theorized, which cripples everything in the fairy world as well as the human world because it turns out Opal Cowboy parts were sold under the table to all of humanity, and future Opal ceases to exist because of the paradox, right? Wrong. It turns out that future Opal undergoes a weird explosion thing, but rather than die, she instead harnesses that power and uses it to escape and try to end the human world. But here's the thing. Again, how can she exist when her past self is dead, meaning that she shouldn't exist here in the present? And the answer conveniently given is that rather than disappear, they created an alternate dimension and forked the timeline. Man, it must be great to break all of your own established rules for the world all so that you can just make convenient butt pulls. Why respect the lore, right? I will say that after this time travel crap gets dropped, the plot itself is quite good, and the resolution is actually satisfying. It even pulls a weird The Outsiders ending where it starts telling the story from the first line of the first book. If you don't know The Outsiders, just know it's an old book that teachers used to make junior high school kids read in English class. If you've ever heard the line, "Stay gold, pony boy," that's where it's from. It's a fine book. Honestly, it just seems like whoever wrote the time paradox screwed over Culfer so badly that he didn't know how to fix it and just did a half-hearted attempt, knowing that there was no good way to fix it. I despise you, writer of the time paradox. You irrevocably ruin the series with your stupidity and attempt to make your mark on the series. In closing, I will say that on the whole I enjoyed the series, though near the end I really wanted to read something that flexed my brain muscles, but what's there is for the most part solid. I do recommend the books, just know that books 6 and 8 have some rather glaring flaws, but everything else are fun standalone books involving capers and saving the world. I don't have much else to say, so thanks for watching and have a good day.